Institute. Welcome to a special webinar on the 12th anniversary of No Child Left Behind. Very happy to be joined here this morning by Kathleen Porter-Magee, the Bernard Lee Schwartz Policy Fellow at the Thomas B. Fordham Institute and also Senior Advisor at the College Board. Welcome, Kathleen.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, and also Matt Chingos, Fellow at the Brookings Institution. I like how you guys keep your titles very, very straightforward.
We do.
All right, thanks for being here, Matt. We got two fellows with us. We are going to talk about No Child Left Behind. Apologies for our late start. Had some technical problems. Though, in fairness, we might be delayed here this morning, but it's not nearly as delayed as No Child Left Behind reauthorization. All right. So what we're going to be doing this morning is talking about what the impact of the law has been on America's classrooms, more prospects going forward as possible. So please do tweet your questions, your comments to NCLB chat, and we're going to be from time to time checking in on that Twitter traffic, and especially by being able to go over to the Twitter desk, which is going to be manned by Michelle Ginninger, our
Yes, tweet your questions, NCLB chat.
Okay, so now, one thing that we've been looking at this week is 12 years since No Child Left Behind. Of course, 12 is important because back then the law said that 100% of and then the next day, which would have been, January 9th, they came back at the Daughters of the American Republic Hall in Washington, D.C., something like 3,000 people there who had been involved with the law. And again, it was the President Bush, Ted Kennedy, John Boehner, Senator Gregg. And then they went on a victory tour. They literally flew around the country, the four of them, celebrating this new law. Can you imagine? Now, after 12 years later, he was willing to stand up and say, "I love No Child Left Behind." It's come a long way. Mission accomplished. Yes, that's mission accomplished. A long time efficiency in reading and math by any measure, but it has been long enough that we should be something about the law's impact, at least in its early years. Let's say, the first 5 or 6 years. It's So what do we know? I mean, can we say that did No Child Left Behind change teaching and learning? Did it change schools? Did it move the needle on student achievement? But Matt, let's start with you. What's your take on this?
I think the best specific research study of the impact of No Child Left Behind looks specifically at the accountability provisions. So it's a study by Tom D. and Brian Jacob, and what they did is they compared states that already had accountability systems prior to the passage of NCLB to states that had to adopt them because of what the law mandated.
Yep.
And they looked at the relative changes in student achievement on NAEP in those two groups of states and find that NCLB did have a pretty significant positive impact on math scores in 4th and 8th grade,
yeah,
which is the grades tested by NAEP, but not so much on reading scores. I'm also aware of some research that looked specifically at the supplemental education services provision, where after a couple years of not meeting standards, students get access to things like after-school tutoring and finding some positive effects there.
Yeah.
So I think there certainly is some evidence of positive effects. There's a lot of rhetoric out there that NCLB has done all sorts of terrible things. I'm not aware of any consistent evidence that really points to that happening in a systematic way. Of course, there's always anecdotes, but
all right, so we'll come back to that piece. Okay, so on the achievement though, so it seems like there's a pretty good consensus that in the late 90s, as some states adopted testing and accountability, we saw this big jump in test scores for those states. And then as the other states came on board with No Child Left Behind, they saw that similar jump. And then there was something of a plateau, right? I mean, we had that, it was sort of a one-time big gain, and then it has kind of, we've maintained that progress, but we haven't continued it per se. So Kathleen, when you think about that, I mean, how do we explain that? What do you think, I mean, do we have any idea, what were schools doing differently that suddenly they were, getting better achievement scores, at least in math?
Well, I mean, I think it suggests that actually school level accountability, actually holding schools accountable for student achievement is important and meaningful and something we shouldn't walk away from. I think probably the reason that it was a one-time leap is that it's probably easy to make initial gains, but then it's harder to continue to get better. And that continuous improvement actually requires classroom level instructional changes that are just simply more difficult. And that's where I think we were able to see a one-time leap, but we haven't made the continued progress. And I think partially because we haven't evolved. The law hasn't evolved. I think a lot of our curriculum and instructional practices haven't evolved as maybe we might have hoped they would have.
And let's be very precise here. I mean, most of the gains came at the bottom of the performance spectrum, right? It was the lowest performing kids who made the biggest gains. Those kids were more likely to be low income, more likely to be African American and Latino. In many respects, those were the kids the law was about. It was about leaving no child left behind. And so, and we know states set very low bars in terms of proficiency in general, right? And all the pressure of the law was to get more kids over that low bar. And so it's not surprising the system seems to have responded. And so it was those, schools with lots of low performing kids that made some big gains, and as the lowest performing kids that made progress. And now the question would be, well, if we raise the bar, as some states or most states are trying to do with Common Core, can we start to move the needle, maybe at least in the middle, if not at the top of the performance distribution as well? Let's talk about reading for a second here. It's true that we have not made as much progress in reading as we have in math, though I did a little analysis of this last week looking at the No Child Left Behind generation, the first group of kids who came in after the law was passed. Those kids are now juniors in high school. When they were fourth graders, you did see this pretty significant bump up in reading achievement, again, especially for low-performing students. And then it was maintained somewhat in the eighth grade. Now, I would argue, again, I'm biased, I was in the administration, right? So, but that maybe something like reading first, this big focus on scientifically based reading instruction, maybe did have some impact there too. I mean, what do you think, Matt? Is that compelling to you, or do we need more of this kind of rigorous studies to be able to look at before and after?
I think if we want to take some change in an outcome like test scores and say this is the result of some policy, I think we do need to have at least some kind of comparison group to say these are the kids that got it and these are the kids that didn't, and we think maybe they're at least somewhat similar, and make that kind of comparison. So, I wouldn't take some change, and because once you get into that kind of territory, well then, it opens a Pandora's box where everyone has their policy, and so we have a trend, and we can say, oh, it was this or oh, it was that. So, I mean, if you look at the last decade, if we think NCLB had some major positive or negative impact, sure, you'd expect that to be there somewhere. But I think it's hard to kind of take that apart and assign different pieces of it to different policies.
Kathleen, what do you think on the reading piece? I mean, my sense is, but again, I haven't seen any study that's really nailed this down, is that that we are doing a better job teaching phonics and teaching kids how to decode. I mean, back in the 90s, we were still having these big reading wars. Right, and then the National Reading Panel came out. There was this big push for scientifically based reading instruction. That was in reading first. My sense is if you look today at the textbooks, at the instructional practices going on in those early grades, that it would look different than maybe it did back in the 90s. We don't seem to have as much buzz about those reading wars. I mean, what do you, is that your sense too, that we've kind of at least figured out the decoding piece?
I mean, I think that you'd be hard pressed to find somebody completely ignoring phonics. I mean, I think the reading wars were based on the idea. There were some people who believed that phonics was almost unnecessary. That was the whole language fight, essentially.
Yep.
And I think that Reading First did put that to rest. I mean, I don't think we've gotten to the point where phonics is being taught equally systematically. I mean, that's not even the best way to describe it, but as systematically across all schools and across all districts. I mean, I think there are certainly places that are doing it better than others. But yeah, I mean, I think you'd be hard pressed to walk into a school that ignores phonics completely. And certainly I think that is helpful. But I mean, I think getting back to the initial question, why have we seen changes in math, but we haven't seen similar gains in reading, even if we've seen some minimal ones? I mean, I think that the answer seems somewhat clear to say, well, you can isolate math and you can isolate math instruction. I think one of the downsides of NCLB is that we tried to isolate reading instruction in a vacuum, much the same way we did math, and I just don't think you can do that as neatly. And
so in other words, that we tried to teach reading as a skill. Right?
Yeah, as a skill and as an isolated subject, as if your reading comprehension could rise or fall independent of learning in other content areas. And I think we know that that's not true. It's just reading and writing don't exist in a vacuum. Whereas you can actually pull math aside and say, we're going to teach these skills and they build on themselves and we're going to focus this 60 minutes and we can make pretty major gains in 60 or 90 minutes a day. So
let's unpack that a little bit more. So one of the big complaints people make about No Child Left Behind, about testing, is that it has encouraged schools to do less teaching of things like history and science, art and music, especially in the elementary school grades. And I would say, there's some evidence from the schools and staffing survey and a few other places that it does look like there is somewhat less time spent on those subjects now than there used to be in the elementary schools. I don't think you see that in middle schools and high schools as much, but in elementary schools. And the idea was, a lot of schools went to these huge reading blocks. We're going to do these 90 or 120-minute reading blocks. And we're going to just, we'll wait. Social studies and science can wait until, later, once the kids learn to decode and get those reading comprehension. We'll wait till 4th or 5th grade or middle school, right?
Well, it was even that, hey, how can we expect kids to learn science or history if they don't know how to read? Yeah. So it was almost like an if-then. First we teach them how to read, and then they will be able to dive deep.
Okay, so that sounds good. So what's wrong with that strategy?
You need science and history and art and everything else in order to be able to push your comprehension. I mean, your reading comprehension you're not going to be able to make gains in reading comprehension just by practicing reading strategies and skills. Yes, there is some evidence that you can make kind of one-time leaps, but with some isolated reading skills and strategies instruction. But you really need it. Once you've learned how to read, once you've learned how to decode, you need to learn content and you need to know more vocabulary in order to deepen your comprehension.
Right, and this could be considered one of the great tragedies of the No Child Left Behind era, right? Is that this message that, teaching content is teaching reading, that was totally missed. And so schools thought they were doing the right thing by saying, we're going to just focus on reading, we'll save the other stuff for later, when in fact that might have been very counterproductive. Or at least, maybe it led to bigger one-time year-to-year gains in reading, but it does not helping the kids actually build the content knowledge they need to become better readers. Let's go over to our Twitter desk. And Michelle, what do we have over there? Some questions?
Yes, we have some great questions coming in. We've talked about math and reading and those scores, but we've got a question from John Halbin. How has NCLB impacted non-cognitives, dropouts, misbehavior, etc.? Should these be included as evaluators in the next ESEA?
Okay, good questions. Matt, we can't relate this to No Child Left Behind, but in recent years, what have the trends been on high school graduation and dropout rates? I mean, is there any evidence that the testing accountability is encouraging kids to drop out at faster rates?
It's a great question. I'm not aware of, I actually don't know what the specific trend has been over the last 10 years. Maybe one of you do, but I think it absolutely should be part of the conversation. I mean, what NCLB did was it gave us access to a lot more testing data than we'd ever had before, and I think we ever would have had in a lot of states. And I think that on the whole has been a good thing. But at the same time, it's also raised concerns that we don't want to look just at tests, we want to look at other outcomes that are important as well. And I think high school graduation, dropping out, going to college, where you go to college,
Yep.
those kinds of things absolutely should be on the table along with test scores.
Yeah, I mean, my understanding is, look, we have made some real progress in recent years on the high school graduation rate. Now, those kids, I mean, again, I think we got to be very careful about any link with No Child Left Behind. I mean, those kids, because they're older, I mean, NCLB started as they were already, well through their K through 12 system. Lots of other things happening in the economy and elsewise that could explain that. But it seems like most trends, I mean, look, I have a hard time thinking of a trend over the last 10 years that has gone in the wrong direction, per se, in a big way. I mean, this is both educationally and many of the social indicators, until the Great Recession at least, that kids are, look, there's lower drug use, there's lower, smoking, there's lower alcohol use, there's lower teenage pregnancy. I mean, that most of these social indicators are heading in the right direction. So if No Child Left Behind was leading to some kind of adverse consequences on some of these other things, at least I don't see it in the data yet.
Yeah, I mean, you know more about this than I do for sure, but I think that, NCLB and a lot of has sort of become a whipping post, but I think you're right. I mean, I think there's not a lot of evidence that it's, other than perhaps narrowing the curriculum, which is something we need to address and we need to deal with. I don't think it's been a real serious net negative.
But it certainly was built on this theory of action that cognitive skills, that the academic skills were the most important ones, or at least really important, right? That what we're trying to do is help, especially low-income kids, do much better in reading and math, so they have a better shot at either going to college or getting some kind of credential, so that they may get out of the poverty into the middle class. And there's been this conversation in recent years to say, look, okay, academic skills are important, but these non-cognitive skills, grit, determination, executive function, that these things matter a lot too. Maybe matter more if the truth is most of the low-income kids are not going to go to college. They're going to end up in a low-skill, low-wage job, and whether or not they're going to succeed in getting out of poverty has much more to do with these non-cognitive skills. So we should be pushing those as much as the academic skills.
I mean, I guess, so it's really interesting. I mean, was NCLB based on the notion that these cognitive skills were more important, or was it based on the notion that we were not doing a good job of tracking these cognitive skills, particularly among our most disadvantaged students? And I mean, I think there are very few, I don't know anybody, and I'm sure there are very few people who would disagree that there are lots of other things that are very, very important. Mm-hmm. And that's why I know something like, parent choice and parent engagement and involvement in school decisions is so important, because there is a limit to what a state can and should measure and to the information that they should be providing at a large scale. And, the people who are sort of best positioned to make decisions about how well schools are serving some of those other soft indicators, I think, are the parents and local communities. And so, I mean, I think in the standards era, I look at standards and accountability as that is narrowly what states should be focusing on. What are the cognitive skills that students should have, and are schools meeting those cognitive benchmarks? And then in order to make sure that schools are meeting these other needs, which are incredibly important, I don't think we should have, with the exception of possibly dropout rates and school safety and some other indicators, I'm not sure that the state should be increasingly heavy-handed in dictating how schools should meet those other needs.
That's interesting. So the argument is sort of let school choice be the mechanism by which we promote these non-cognitive skills. I mean, you've studied some of this, Matt, right? I mean, that you've got some of these Catholic schools and charter schools out there that are very much focused on character or these non-cognitive skills, whatever you want to call them. And we're starting to be able to track in some studies their impact on these sorts of things, right?
Right. So the one study that you might be referring to is the study Paul Peterson and I did of school vouchers in New York City, and we found that overall there wasn't a voucher effect on college enrollment, because we were tracking these kids over a long period of time. But for the subgroup of African American kids, which was about half of the sample of these low-income kids, those kids, well, in the original studies, they had higher test scores, and in our long-run study, they're more likely to go to college. I'd also add that in thinking about NCLB and cognitive and non-cognitive outcomes, it seems implausible to me that the kinds of schools that were doing a terrible job on the cognitive piece pre-NCLB were doing a great job on the non-cognitive piece. And these kids, they couldn't read and they couldn't do math, but they came out of school with a lot of grit and were being really successful in life.
Right.
Yeah.
So maybe it's true that we've put too much emphasis on cognitive skills, but by amping up the emphasis on cognitive skills, it just suggests to me that maybe we also now need to amp up emphasis on non-cognitive skills, not necessarily through policy, but through choice mechanisms or what have you.
All right, let's talk a little bit about teachers. This was, we may forget the highly qualified teachers provision. It feels like such a long time ago that anyone took those seriously. Right. But that was a big part of the law. This was something George Miller, Democrat, at the time chairman of the House Education Committee, pushed very hard for. Groups like Ed Trust were big behind. And it was one of the first things that people noticed about the law was suddenly teachers were hearing you are going to be judged about whether or not you are, quote, highly qualified. Mm-hmm. Do we have any idea whether this effort to qualify teachers as highly qualified, did this do any good? Did it do any harm? Was it just a big nothing burger?
It's really hard to imagine it having much of an impact. I mean, I'm not aware of specific research about NCLB of that provision, but if you look at all of what we know about how master's degrees don't matter, how it doesn't matter whether a teacher ponied up tens of thousands of dollars or spent 6 weeks in TFA or did nothing, that the differences there are either non-existent or really small. So if we believe all this evidence, and I think it's pretty compelling, that formal education training programs, most of them that exist are basically worthless. Yep. It's hard to imagine that provision of saying you have to have that had any positive effect on student achievement, and it may have been had bad impacts on teacher retention, made it hard to get good people. And I think it's unfair to teachers to require them to spend a whole bunch of money to get a credential that's basically worthless.
So Kathleen, part of the time that this law was being implemented, you were helping to run Achievement First and Charter School Network, which didn't necessarily have to have certified teachers, although maybe in your state it did, but it did have to pay attention to the subject matter requirements of highly qualified teachers. Were they helpful? Were they a pain? What were they?
We didn't discuss much the highly qualified teacher. I mean, there were certification requirements. We were in Connecticut and we did have to have certified teachers. We hired a lot of TFA alums, Teach for America alums, and so they did have certification and they had gone through ed school as part of their Teach for America training and as part of their ongoing education. I can tell you that we relied on our own internal professional development, which included ongoing coaching and included a pretty intense new teacher training program, and it included ongoing both kind of whole group with all of our teachers together professional development, and again the one-on-one coaching. That is what we looked at to judge the qualifications of our teachers. Yeah. We knew we had to comply with whatever the state law was, and we did it, but that's not where we looked. Yeah. Those were not the indicators of quality we looked for.
So what are some, when we start to look back on some of these things, what is there anything that stands out as especially successful about the No Child Left Behind strategy? And then, what were the things that we should really be learning about its failures, where it really missed the mark? Let's talk on the successes. What are some things? So we've talked about how it does seem to have moved the needle, especially in math. What do we take from that? Was that just a one-time deal, and now we sort of benefited all we can from accountability? We need to find something else? What's your take on this, Matt?
I think it showed that there was some slack in the system, that there were some inefficiencies that could be squeezed out quickly, some low-hanging fruit that schools could harvest by putting some pressure on them, maybe reallocating effort from one area that wasn't showing up in math scores to another area. That did. But more broadly, I think the big success has been putting data out there that can show people how are kids doing in general. How's every state doing on NAEP? That was something we didn't have before NCLB. How is every school doing? How are these subgroups doing? And if you think about the impacts on teachers, all the conversation we're having now about teacher value added and teacher evaluation and the fact that we can, with some reliability, identify who's contributing to student achievement and who's not, with a sufficient amount of data.
You clearly have not been following Randy Weingarten on Twitter, because VAM is a sham, she says. But we'll get into that later. Okay.
But we would not be having that conversation but for NCLB. At least at the national level, we're having it now, because we wouldn't have a decade of research showing how important teachers are, and we wouldn't have the developments in data and methodology that enable us to implement these VAM methods, which obviously are also very controversial.
Yeah. What do you think, Kathleen? Anything else? Any other successes?
Yeah, I mean, I think while there's this whole debate about whether standards matter, I still believe that they do, and I believe that we have some research that suggests that they do. And Morgan Polikoff, who has done some research that shows that standards do influence classroom level instruction. I mean, that's the point is obviously to impact what is taught and what is learned in the classroom every day. And we have some evidence that standards do influence instruction, particularly when standards are well aligned to the state assessment system. So I think that says that standards are still very important, and getting that right is not just a compliance exercise. It's actually a really important one that affects teachers and students every day.
Right, and I mean, so this gives you some optimism that if we get the standards right, a la Common Core, that this could translate into some actual changes in the classroom, positive changes.
I think so, yeah. If we get the assessments right, too. I mean, it seems like the standards is step one, necessary but wildly insufficient. But I do think it means if we can figure out a way to get this assessment right. Because I think that largely we haven't gotten the assessments right in the NCLB era, and it's time to evolve.
All right, over to the Twitter desk. Michelle, what else? What other questions do we have?
That's the perfect pivot point, because lots of questions are, we've talked about what we've learned. Where do we go next? And the Hoover Institution wants to know, given what we've learned about NCLB, what course of action does Michael Petrilli suggest moving forward?
By the way, good for Hoover and our other friends on the West Coast, bright and early here. Breakfast at Fordham's. This is great. Appreciate you tuning in. So what do we need to do going forward? Look, I think that we're going to get to some of that as we have this conversation. I mean, my own view is that there have been some successes here. I mean, we talk about data, we talk about the pressure putting on the systems, we talk about changing instruction. I mean, I think reading first is one of those parts of No Child Left Behind that is deeply underappreciated. It got caught up in this quasi-scandal. The scandal was really just that you had federal officials that were trying to hold the line on the law, in my view, which is the law said very clearly, if you want to get the money, state school districts, you've got to actually teach scientifically based reading instruction. And the publishers said, oh yeah, whatever, we'll stamp that on our books that were scientifically based, even if they were not. And the federal officials said, no, we're serious. Only stuff that really is aligned with this new research. Sounds familiar, right? Now we are implementing the Common Core standards. The publishers right away stamp Common Core aligned on that. And the question is, who's going to push them to say, no, we're serious. You really need to come out with materials that are aligned. And in this case, it is not a federal role, and I don't think it should be. And we saw what happened politically when you try to have the feds playing that role. But who is it going to be? Somebody needs to be able to play that role. I mean, I think we underappreciate the importance of having, for example, textbooks evolve in important ways. I mean, Russ Whitehurst at Brookings has talked about the importance of curriculum, the importance of making, which math program you use actually matters quite a bit, right? Yet that gets almost no discussion in the policy world. And so that's something that we need to talk about. We'll get back to this Hoover question about going forward in a little bit. Let's talk about some of the big mistakes that the law made, perhaps things they got wrong or where they overreached. We talked already about highly qualified teachers. I think we can probably all agree that was pretty silly to look so heavily at credentials. Anything else that you would say was a big failure?
I think this whole focus on percent proficient was a big mistake. I think the idea that we're going to take this one test and we're going to set a cut point and only care about the percent of people who are over it or under it is crazy. I mean, I see how it kind of lined up with this idea of No Child Left Behind. And if it really was, we just want everyone to be able to read at a basic level and do math, well, then that would call for a very low standard. But at the same time, people, in Fordham, you guys like high standards and high expectations. And I'm certainly sympathetic to the idea we want to have high expectations for students in general. But I don't think we should embody that in a cut score on one test that says if you're above this, you're okay, and we can forget about you. And if you're just below it, we're going to focus on you. And that's been kind of the worry that NCLB has put too much focus on students right near that cut score. So what I think is much more sensible is we want to test kids. We want to have information from high quality tests, linked to high quality standards. But I'm much more interested in the average score, perhaps for different subgroups of students, perhaps showing progress for people at different parts of the achievement spectrum. But to just say, 40% were over some cutoff, it's so arbitrary. And in the end, because the standard, the cut points varied, it ended up being meaningless.
Yeah. And what's interesting about that is that there's still not, there's some general agreement that, yes, we should look at progress over time, but I think some advocates out there actually like that there was this focus on the lowest performing kids, right? Those kids were overwhelmingly poor and minority kids, and that if we start looking at saying, well, we care about other kids in the middle, kids at the top, progress for everybody, that's going to take some of the focus away from the neediest kids. That there's an argument that says we should just keep focusing like a laser on those kids who are so far behind. That when you look at American performance, our big problem isn't at the average or at the top, it's at the bottom. And so let's keep at that.
But if you're going to set a high cut score, you're not doing that. Right?
That's
if you're
exactly
setting a
right.
cut score that says only 20% of kids are proficient, well, you're saying 80% of these kids are being left behind. So
That's right.
It seems that there really was a disconnect between this idea of focus on low-performing kids, but have high standards where high standards are defined in terms of a high cut score?
Well, I think what's changed is that over time, people have said, okay, we've made some progress at the low-performing kids, but we do care about kids at the middle and kids at the top. It's not just equity. We care about, every kid out there, and we care about international competition.
I think one of the challenges is, accountability. I'm not sure it works well as a blunt instrument, and certainly not as a blunt instrument coming from the federal level. I think having a little bit more nimbleness and having something that's a little bit more nuanced, I think is necessary. And that's where I think in the charter world you have some interesting. You have these chartering models, and you have schools that are really kind of thoughtfully setting what their goals are for the next 5 years, and a little bit more involved. So, I think one of the lessons is, yes, we do need accountability. Accountability matters, but I think accountability can't be just a blunt instrument coming from on very, very high.
Yeah, and that's the other question, the sort of federalism questions here, right? We've talked mostly about sort of, okay, the testing, the teachers, but then there is this thing about it. This was a sort of new relationship between the federal government and the states, and in many ways, it was the federal government constraining the state action quite a bit in terms of what they could do with their own accountability systems and other policies. Was that an overreach? Was that too much? Do we need to get back to a point where the states, get to have a lot more flexibility? This is the big question, right?
Well, and that's the interesting thing. You've seen a lot of talk, I think, especially on the right, about the whole idea of subsidiarity. The idea that that policy should be done by the lowest level of government that can do it well. I think that last piece often gets lost in the conversation. So there are a lot of folks who say, well, subsidiarity. So obviously, parents and schools, they should make all of the decisions. And I'm not sure that's exactly right, because what we saw are teachers, because what we saw is that prior to the standards era, teachers would set expectations based on the kids who were in front of them. And that really hurt our most disadvantaged kids, the poor and the minority students, because they would come in behind. And if I set my expectations based on the students sitting in front of me, not based on some objective measure, then I was holding disadvantaged students to a lower bar. So that's saying, well, okay, yeah, so maybe at the absolute local level, that's not the best place to set standards, because that's not going to set an equal playing field. But I think the issue of subsidiarity does bring up an interesting question about who should control what. And where do we allow the most nimbleness so that teachers and schools and leaders can meet the very, very diverse needs of the kids in front of them, but to make sure that expectations are more uniform so that all kids do have an equal opportunity. And I think that we haven't figured that all out yet, but I don't think the answer is to swing the pendulum all the way back to where it was before NCLB.
This is the heart of it, right? Is at the heart of NCLB is this question of what does it mean to be a good school versus a bad school, and just values. To what degree are we focused on the lowest performing kids? How much do we care about the achievement gap? Is it progress over time? Are we focused on equity? Are we focused on competitiveness? All of those questions are, at the end of the day, value questions, and it's then a political question of should those decisions be made nationally at the federal level by Congress, or should states have some leeway? And the worry on the left, I think, was always that if you give states leeway, they will choose to ignore the needy kids, who they have often been ignored in the past. Look, I think we're in a different place now than we were 12 years ago. There's a much more active reform sector than there was 12 years ago. I'm not so sure that all that many states would go back to ignoring those kids. But I also think, look, that you can make strong arguments on a lot of these different pieces, that you could get a panel of experts looking at the same school, and different people will come up with different decisions about whether that school is a good school or not, based on your values, and there's not necessarily a right answer or a wrong answer, and we need to be clear about that. Again, here you are with the Thomas B. Fordham Institute talking about No Child Left Behind at 12. Joining me, Kathleen Porter-Magee from Fordham and the College Board, Matt Chingos from the Brookings Institution. If you have any questions or comments, you can tweet them to NCLB Chat. Let's go over now to our Twitter desk with Michelle. Michelle, you got any questions or comments for us?
Well, this is a comment that I'd like to hear your reaction for. It would be amazing to get some feedback from Chancellor Carmen Farina on this in terms of NYC demo and Common Core. So can you talk about the politics that's happening in New York and what this means going forward for ed reform?
All right, yeah. So
and some Hershey stuff in
absolutely,
there?
And I like the way you said Farina. Very good. That people have got to use that tilde in her name. Yes, very good. All right, so some people are saying, look, the politics are shifting. We've got some places where the left is resurgent, and you have other places where the right is resurgent, kind of new populist sentiment out there in our politics today. when you look at something like de Blasio's been saying, Farinia's been saying in New York, they've been talking a lot about less testing. We need to get back to this focus of teaching being something filled with joy. Is this a rebuke to No Child Left Behind? Is that how you see it?
I have to say that I always, I hate the idea that you can't teach with joy in an era of standards, testing, and accountability. I've personally not seen that to be the case. I've seen lots of classrooms filled with lots of joy, and I've seen all kinds of different classrooms that can meet the standards and that can exist in an NCLB world. So I think that's a false dichotomy to say that we either have standards and accountability and this sort of draconian instructional model, or we have this place where kids can flourish and they can be kids and they can be happy. That's just not true.
Right.
These can exist together. Have we in the NCLB era seen too much testing? Yeah, the pendulum has probably swung a little bit too far. I think that as consumers, as schools and districts and states, I think we should be putting more pressure in our RFPs for assessments. To create assessments that do what we need them to do with in shorter periods of time, and so I think that we can put more pressure on the test development companies than I think we have been.
We can say to them, we want your tests to be joyful. We want the kids smiling and singing while they're doing their testing.
I always think, Steve Jobs. I go to Steve Jobs when I think about things like this, probably also because January 2010 was when the iPod was released. But, he would have probably, if he were working in education today, he would walk in and say, I want a test that measures these important skills. I want it to take no more than this number of hours. I want it to, and he would just have a list of demands.
Right.
And he would say,
Design
do
challenges.
that. Yeah, exactly. And I don't think we do a really good job of thinking creatively about what the next generation assessments look like and what they mean and what we can do with them. And I think we do need to get more creative, but I absolutely don't think the answer is to go back to an era where we we didn't have state assessments.
Well, and so Matt, Farinia, one thing that's very clear that she and de Blasio are going to do, they're going to get rid of the A to F system in New York City for grading schools. So they're going to, is that reasonable? A lot of people say, look, the A to F scores were focused way too much on test scores and didn't get at all this other important stuff. So let's get rid of them. What's your take on that?
There's real trade-offs here. On one hand, you want to provide information to people in a simple, intelligible way, right? When you go to a restaurant in New York City, there's many dimensions to how hygienic or dirty the restaurant is, right? But people get a letter grade, and that's helpful, right? Because it sends a signal. And with schools, it's the same thing. Is there just one dimension of school quality that's all parents should care about? Of course not, right? That's crazy. But at the same time, if you overwhelm people with information, they may have a hard time making good choices because they have lots of other things to figure out, and it's a lot to digest. So is A to F the one best way to rate schools? No, of course not. But at the same time, we don't want to go back to an era where we put a bunch of percent proficient numbers on spreadsheets somewhere and try and let people sort it out who don't necessarily have the sophistication that's needed or the time that's needed to do that.
Right. But what's ironic to me is that what's going to happen? They get rid of the A to F. So then people will have to rely on the state system, which is totally confusing. What they're going to do is they're going to go to gradeschools.net, and it's going to be 1 through 10, and it's totally based on percent proficient, right? It's going to be a worse measure in many ways than, in a less fair measure than what New York City had come up with, which was a fairly nuanced, they really did try to bring in lots of different measures. So there you have it, my own view on that one. All right, so here we are in 2014. The law has not been updated, but Arne Duncan has taken it upon himself to, in effect, change the law via administrative waivers. And now there is greater flexibility at the state level. Again, the states had a chance to rewrite their accountability systems, to look at things like progress over time, to drop the highly qualified teachers provision. So, at this point, are we now in a pretty good place where it comes to No Child Left Behind? Have these waivers pretty much fixed the problem, and now we have a regime that is working, and we can just kind of keep going forward with, assuming Congress will never actually pass another law again. What do you think, Kathleen?
That is a good question. I am definitely not the ESEA waiver expert. I suspect that the waivers do not solve all of the problems. I think that there are some people who have said that states are still not quite learning the right lessons about their statewide testing and accountability systems, and I think we can still get a little bit more creative and a little bit more intentional there. So I don't think our work here is done, but that's exactly the problem with NCLB is we sort of passed the law and then our work was done for 11 years before we did anything again. So I think the biggest lesson from NCLB is that this needs to be iterative. We do learn things, not that we need to fluctuate wildly every year, but we need to evolve as we have new information and as we know more about what good standards implementation looks like, about what good school accountability looks like. We need to be able to be a little bit more nimble, and I think NCLB needs to be a little bit more nimble.
You know, Matt, another recent Morgan Polikoff study that came out recently, would get a lot of shout outs to Morgan, he deserves it, doing great work, is a look at how these accountability systems are working in the waiver era. And what he found was that actually very few states took the opportunity to move to a system that is dominantly about progress. That you still have most systems that are looking at percent proficient as the major determination of whether a school is failing or not, or a focus school or priority school. So you still have states, in many cases, intervening in schools because they have low proficiency rates, regardless of how they're doing on progress. I mean, to me, this is a big problem, right? Do you agree?
I agree with you. I think maybe one explanation for that is it's much easier to measure the number percent of kids over some arbitrary cut point on a test. It's what states have been doing for more than a decade.
Yeah.
So going to a growth-based system involves longitudinal databases, which many states have.
Yep.
But the offices that does that is often different from the office that has to calculate the the accountability ratings. So we're still in this world of percent proficient, and I don't think people even really understand what percent proficient is. I mean, the case in point is as states transition to Common Core tests, we see all these headlines about how scores are dropping.
Yeah.
But it's a new test with a new cut point, a new definition of proficient. So the idea that going from 30% proficient to 20% proficient is a drop in scores is wrong, right? It's just completely wrong, and that's what's been leading the news in states like New York. So it just shows how unhelpful that measure is to parents and to policymakers.
And our big effort now to actually try to do something about these failing schools, however we define them, the School Improvement Grants Program, we're now $5-6 billion into this thing, and what evidence do we have that it's working? Zero evidence that it's working, right? I don't know. We don't know. We don't know almost nothing about this. Should we at all be hopeful that this big effort to turn around our failing schools? At the end of the day, No Child Left Behind said, look, we're going to identify the schools that are not doing well, and we're going to do something about them. And have we done anything to fix these low-performing schools?
Well, we've shone a spotlight on them, right? That's something. It's good to have an idea of which schools need additional help. But I think, it's such a hard nut to crack. What is the magic elixir that's going to fix schools that are really struggling? It's a really complicated mixture of a bunch of different things. And I think that
we don't know. We don't have a clue how to do this. Is that fair, Matt? We have no idea how to do it.
The idea that we can do it.
I don't know that we have no
Washington,
idea.
The federal government can do it from Washington. The NCLB model was. It's the sort of bureaucratic checklist, right? You miss AYP for 1 year and this happens, 2 years and this happens, and after 6 years you got to shut down the school or do something else. And what did everyone do? Something else, which was nothing. So now the idea that you give people some money to do it, not clear that that's going to work any better. So I think there's a much clearer case to be made for the federal role to be transparency, to be mandating that if you're as a state going to take federal dollars for your schools, you have to have good transparency. And then perhaps to couple that with choice. To say maybe the way to go at this is not to have the government tell schools how to do better or to force them to do better, but provide people with good information and then enable them to actually make some choices. And not necessarily in terms of vouchers in private schools, which is very controversial, but just among the public schools in your area.
That perhaps the government that can't build a website doesn't know how to turn around failing schools. All right, let's go to we'll get back to Kathleen. Let's go to the Twitter desk, Michelle. What do we have on there that is relevant to this question right now? What are people saying?
I'll say we mentioned SIG, and Andy Smerrick has not been tweeting, so we should find out where he is.
Yes, where is
he? It's his birthday.
Oh,
Today is his birthday as well. So
we're celebrating.
Well, going off school choice, Ted here tweeted a few minutes ago about what NCLB can do to improve charter authorizing and closure practices. This is something our Ohio team has strong feelings about. Let's shift this conversation to some more school choice.
to charters, this is a good question in that, of course, we need to worry about in the charter school sector how to improve quality, and authorizing is a big part of that. I do worry, though, that we ask this question, and I think that some of our friends on the left have a tendency to do this, to say, well, we have a problem. What could the federal government do to solve it? I mean, I'm not sure the federal government can really do anything that helpful on charter school authorizing. There's been some ideas that in the charter program, as the feds give money out, maybe some of that money could go to charter school authorizers. We could do more research on what good practice looks like. I mean, look, we run education at the state level, right? I mean, this has got to be mostly state policy coming up with good ideas on how to encourage, fund, incentivize charter school authorizers, no?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and also because the answer probably depends wildly depending on the state you're talking about, because each state situation is so different.
Yeah. Look, let me finish something that we were talking about before, about this question about turnarounds, right? Mm-hmm. Should we admit as reformers something that we have never wanted to admit, which is that as long as you have schools that are super high poverty, where you're talking about 80, 90, 100% of the kids are poor, I don't care what you do to that school, those schools are going to be low performing. That we know from research that that it is very, very hard to have a high poverty school that is also high performing, and that every effort that people have made to try to find those needles in a haystack, they just don't hold up over time. I mean, is that something we need to admit, that we need to look at finding ways to break up these concentrations of poverty?
I'm not quite there yet. I mean, I don't think I'm ready to say that it's impossible to have a high-performing school that serves predominantly poor and minority students. Is it much harder? Yeah, of course it is, because the students as a block are coming in much further behind without some of the basic skills, certainly, but also some of the basic services that they need. But I think it just requires different solutions. I think that one of our biggest challenges in education is we constantly, reformers and non-reformers alike, constantly try to look for the one or two silver bullets that are going to fix everything. And I think the challenge is that each school is different. And yes, we can glean best practices, but they really have to be implemented and adapted to meet whatever the needs of the school of the school is. And what I mean by that is not just the students' needs, but also the teachers' needs. Mm-hmm. So, for example, if you have a school that serves predominantly disadvantaged students who are really behind in terms of content and skills, and also you have an inexperienced teacher force, then you probably want to be a little bit more heavy-handed. Curricular choice is critical in that kind of a school, because you have inexperienced teachers who are dealing with real, probably classroom management challenges, mm-hmm. and you want to give them something you want to give them a curriculum that is probably far more scripted. Mm-hmm. Now, if you have the same group of students in a school with very experienced and high-performing teachers, you can probably ease off on curriculum and really let the teachers innovate in a different way. And I just think we need to have different solutions depending on the school. And I don't just mean depending on the student makeup of the school, I mean the faculty as well.
But and so you're talking about subsidiarity again. I mean, it's this idea that we have to have a system that's nimble. And when we have these federal mandates,
and we have to have
state mandates,
honest conversations, like what are the actual strengths and weaknesses of both the kids and the teachers.
But if you have a policy that, we tend to write these policies at the federal level, even the state level, that have to apply equally to everybody, mandates for everybody, it does not lead to that kind of nimbleness that you're talking about. Matt, what do you think? I mean, Richard Rothstein is writing about this again today about segregation. I mean, should we admit that concentrations of poverty, that's a real problem? And, we cannot, it's very hard to find schools, except for schools of choice that may have other advantages, that have, very high concentrations of poverty that also have strong performance. And therefore, the answer has got to be somehow figuring out how to break up those concentrations of poverty.
Of course, concentrations of poverty are a real problem. I don't think I know anyone who would say that that's a fine thing and we shouldn't worry about that at all. I mean, how I spend my time is thinking about education and education policy. So the way I think about it is, well, given the set of problems and constraints we face, what can we do? And I'm not so pessimistic to say that even within the current situation, that it's impossible for schools with lots of low-income kids to do well. As you mentioned, there are sort of proof points that it can be done and that it has been done. You mentioned that a lot of them are charter schools, and I have no idea whether those kinds of models are scalable, whether we could see that those kinds of strategies adopted, in a whole. All right,
but you don't think we need to go back to busing? I mean, that we don't need to go back and have a conversation again about through housing or through busing or other things to just disperse these poor kids because the problem is that they're all, clustered together in the same schools. That is a dead end conversation to you.
I mean, if poverty, I'm not sure what those strategies ought to be because it's not something I work on. I think we absolutely should think about it, but I think that's also going to be really, really hard. You look at the moving to opportunity experiment where families were given vouchers, randomized experiment where families were given vouchers to move from high poverty neighborhoods to what looked like better neighborhoods, and some positive impacts, but it wasn't a home run. Right? You looked at and I don't remember the detailed outcomes for the
the academic outcomes were not very good at all.
But it wasn't much at all. So the idea that that's somehow going to solve this problem, I think, is also a bit of a reach. So I think what we have to think about is, given that we have that set of problems, it's really, really hard to fix. Maybe fixing this.
Real critics of education reform that say, you people in Washington, you keep coming up with these mandates and, forcing it on us. Just leave us alone. Just leave our schools and have success with kids. What's wrong with that strategy of just the sort of saying, we need to stop meddling in these people's affairs?
I think as long as you have, from my perspective, as long as you have standards, some statewide assessment and some accountability, I think that's to some level exactly what you should do. Now, does that mean districts don't get involved either? District leaders can't get involved? Where you get out of the way, but how many people get out of the way? I mean, does it become a classroom teacher working in isolation? That seems like not our best situation. But I agree also that having the state dictate everything is also a little ridiculous.
And when you say accountability, I mean, are you with Matt here where we say, look, there should be transparency. We continue to test kids, put the results out there, but then stop? I mean, no more trying to intervene.
I mean, I think
from the federal or state level.
Well, certainly not from the federal level. I agree that having the feds intervene is not workable. But whether or not there's some percentage of lowest achieving schools that need some intervention from the state or district level, I think there probably are. I think it's transparency for most schools, but I think there probably are some interventions that would actually work, particularly if states, I mean, I wish that states would get out of a lot of the business that they're in right now and focus on a few core things that they can do well. I mean, I think setting standards, I think really focusing on getting the assessments right, knowing that assessments do drive instruction in a meaningful way, I think getting them right is really important, and then intervening in only a needed. And I think if you just pared back state departments of education to a couple of those core functions, you might do a better job.
I noticed you did not include statewide teacher evaluation systems.
I did not include teacher evaluation.
Either at the federal or the state level, and there's consequences. Or we can have choice. Or we can have some combination of those two things. But without choice, if we're going to give schools a monopoly over a lot of these kids, particularly the poor kids that can't afford to go to a private school, can't afford to move to another public school, then we have to hold them accountable, and we have to enforce rules of quality somehow. If instead we're going to give people choices, and those schools don't have all these low-income families as a captive customer base, well then I don't think there's as strong an argument to be made for having accountability across the system. We still might want to decide, just as the FDA does, that there's some schools that are just so rotten we don't want to allow people to make that choice.
Right.
But I think we have to go one direction or the other. We can't have neither. We can't just say, oh, we'll put the data out there, but then schools can do whatever they want, and there's a lot of people who can't take advantage of the data.
And the reason we can't is because at the end of the day, you think, we wouldn't see anything change. We'd still have a lot of kids in bad schools.
Right, because there are people who don't have the resources to go to another school, to move to a neighborhood with a good school and pay those property prices or those rent prices, or pay the tuition at a private school. So, I mean, for our entire history, we've had school choice for people who can afford it. So, I see it sort of as a...
Even that didn't serve as accountability. That's what's interesting about, school choice, and I agree with you. Having school choice as part of an accountability system so that it sent a clearer message. I think right now, even there are lots of neighborhoods where people can afford other options, but still the public school principals are not getting the message that I chose this other option because you're not doing what I want you to do. And you're not serving my kids the way I'm hoping they'd be served by a school. And I think there needs to be...
All right, let's get one last Twitter comment in. Michelle, what you got for us?
Well, it's the last one that came in. Reporting by subgroups has made schools aware of Black, Hispanic, and poor students' needs, but gifted students are still neglected.
Oh, see? So this is a great question. So here we have, again, which kids matter in our system? Where do we set priorities? What are our values? So what about gifted kids? Regardless, they could be minority kids. They could be low-income kids. They could also be white upper-middle-class kids. Right now, there's very little incentive under federal law to pay attention to their needs, make sure they get challenged every day. Is that something that feds should worry about or accountability systems should worry about?
I guess I'm skeptical of the federal government getting involved at this level of detail. I think if we had a system that for too long ignored the needs of disadvantaged students, getting involved and shining a light on that made a lot of sense. I think it's harder to make the case that the gifted students have been the ones really left back in the system. I think there are some gifted kids, particularly from disadvantaged circumstances, that haven't been able to take advantage of the opportunities that their ability would make available for them if they were from more advantaged circumstances. So I think we absolutely should worry about that. It's a much smaller number.
Well, and look, at Fordham we have argued, and I think the evidence is pretty clear that you do see some stagnating at the top in the U.S. We know from the international comparisons that we are not doing very well compared to other countries in terms of boosting the performance of our highest performing kids. The trend lines are not great. And then look in Ohio, where we do have our hometown of Dayton and where we do a lot of work, they now are reporting value-added scores for gifted kids. One way to make this kind of thing transparent. And I think that's something that other states could do too, right?
I think that I think the question about gifted education is a really critical one. It's a really important one, particularly I think, as you mentioned, Matt, for disadvantaged students. I am very concerned about our low-income students who are perfectly capable of things like advanced placement courses, and they're perfectly capable of doing very well in some elite colleges and universities, and who either don't have access to those higher level courses because they don't exist, or don't even know about the opportunities that are available to them. And so I hope that we do increase our focus and emphasis on that, particularly for disadvantaged.
All right, we will let that be the final word. I want to thank Kathleen and Matt for joining us here at the Fordham Institute today for our NCLB chat. Thank you for joining us. Please tell your friends and colleagues, family, children, everybody about this. It'll be online for folks to watch for the rest of time until No Child Left Behind is reauthorized, which could be all of eternity. We'll see. Again, keep the conversation going on Twitter at #NCLB chat. And as always, tune in to edexcellence.net for all the greatest news and views on education reform. I'm Mike Petrilli of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, signing off. Michelle at the Twitter desk, thank you for your great work. Joe, our producer, have a great day. Thank you.